Let me ask you something, and try to answer only inside your mind, not out loud. Have you ever walked into a room and felt instantly that the air knew more than you did? That strange heaviness, like someone left a secret floating there, and the walls were still holding their breath? If you've ever felt that, then you're ready for what I'm about to tell you. Because this story, what happened in Maranhão in 1868, isn't the kind of history you find in school books. It's one of those truths buried so deep that people start pretending it never existed. A truth that lives in the cracks of old houses, in places where the past refuses to stay quiet. So do me a favor, take a slow breath, not to relax, but to be present. Because once you step inside this house, this Casa Grande, you won't walk out the same person. A house that pretended to be silent. Picture this with me for a moment. A massive colonial mansion, whitewashed walls already turning yellow from humidity, standing alone on a hill overlooking endless fields of cotton and sugar. The kind of house built not for comfort or beauty, but to remind everyone who approached it exactly who held power. Now imagine this. It's late afternoon, that hour when the sky doesn't decide if it wants to be gold or gray. The wind is thick, almost too warm to be comforting. And inside the house, past the front doors carved with European angels and Latin inscriptions no one actually read, lies a corridor. Long, narrow, silent in a way that doesn't feel natural. And somewhere inside that corridor is where a girl barely 12 years old first started writing the names of the dead. Not on paper, not on wood, but directly on the walls of the Casa Grande. With what, you might be asking? That's where the story begins to shift from strange to unsettling. The world she was born into. Her name was Leah. No last name. Enslaved people weren't granted that privilege. Sometimes they were given the names of saints, sometimes the names of storms, and sometimes no name at all. Leah belonged to a generation born into chains, but old enough to understand that the world around them was beginning to crack. Abolitionist whispers were spreading to the empire of Brazil, not enough to set anyone free, but enough to make plantation owners paranoid. Imagine a society built entirely on fear. Fear of rebellion, fear of freedom, fear of the enslaved children growing into enslaved adults with sharp minds and sharper memories. And Leah remembered everything. She remembered the faces of people taken away in the middle of the night. She remembered the screams muffled behind doors the masters kept locked. She remembered the way funerals never happened, not because the dead didn't deserve them, but because the living weren't allowed to gather long enough to grieve. In a world like that, memory becomes a type of resistance. But writing their names on the walls, that was something else entirely. How it started, Leah confessed years later to a priest who didn't know what to do with the truth laid in his hands, that the first name she wrote wasn't planned. She wrote it because the walls whispered it. She swore that one night, while carrying a bucket of water down the corridor, she heard something brushing against the plaster. Not footsteps, not voices, more like breath. A name, soft, unmistakable. Anna. Anna had been a young woman from a neighboring plantation, brought in weeks earlier after a punishment left her too weak to work. She died within days. No burial, no prayer, just gone. But Leah wrote her name on the wall anyway, her finger tracing invisible letters until they darkened, as if the wall itself wanted the name to be remembered. Now, listen carefully to this next part, because this is where the atmosphere shifts. The next morning, the name was still there, but it wasn't written in dust, or charcoal, or anything Leah could wash away. The letters were carved, shallow, but unmistakably carved, into the plaster. And Leah had no memory of doing that. When the names began to multiply, after that night, the walls stopped being silent. Every time someone disappeared, whether taken to the punishment shed, sold Maranhão's interior, or simply never seen again, Leah said she felt a pull, a tightness in her chest, a need to walk down that corridor alone. And each time, she'd hear it. One name, clear, insistent. Sometimes it was a whisper. Sometimes it felt like the walls themselves were breathing. And every time she wrote the name, within months, the corridor was full. Over 50 names. Every one of them dead. Every one of them enslaved. People began to avoid the hallway. Animals refused to cross it. Visitors felt dizziness when they stepped near it. The masters blamed moisture, superstition, fever. But the enslaved community knew exactly what it was. A memory refusing to die. And then the house realized what she was doing. That's when everything changed. Because you need to understand something important. Plantation owners in the 19th century feared anything they couldn't control. They feared drums. They feared gatherings. They feared coded songs sung in the fields. They feared silence even more. But a child turning the walls of their home into a graveyard of names? That was beyond fear. That was threat. And by 1868, a year of droughts, rumors of rebellion and tension tightening like rope around the entire province of Maranhão, the masters were ready to do whatever it took to keep the past buried. Even if, before we walk deeper into the story, I want you to pause for a second, not to calm down, not to detach, but to imagine something with full honesty. What would you do if the place you lived in started remembering things no one else dared speak? Because that's what the corridor in the Casa Grande had become. A witness, a ledger, a graveyard carved in plaster and silence. And Leah, this small girl with bare feet and wide, alert eyes, had become its messenger. But every messenger eventually gets noticed. And in 1868, the people who noticed her were not the kind who offered protection. The first time the masters saw the names, it happened by accident. Senora Carlotta, the mistress of the plantation, a woman known more for her sharp tongue than her sharp mind, was returning from the back veranda when she cut to the north corridor instead of the south. Maybe it was fate. Maybe she was distracted by the heat. Maybe the universe decided it was time for things to break open. The moment she stepped in, she stopped walking. Her candle flickered, illuminating the wall in a warm, trembling light. Dozens of names. Dozens. Some small, some large, some carved deep enough to catch shadow. Carlotta screamed, not out of guilt or compassion or horror at the deaths those names represented, but out of fear. Fear of something she couldn't command. Fear of something that refused to obey her. Let that sink in for a moment. The only thing powerful enough to frighten a woman who owned human lives was memory. Memory she could not erase. The house turned hostile. After that night, everything tightened. Doors were slammed shut more often. The enslaved people were ordered not to walk near the north corridor at all. Servants were told to wash the walls. And when the names refused to fade, they were told to scrape them. When scraping didn't work, they painted over the corridor, thick white paint. 3 coats, but the paint didn't hold. Within days, the names bled straight through it. Not darker, just undeniably present. That's when the masters began sleeping with lamps burning. That's when the whispers started spreading among visitors who tried to spend a night in the house and woke up gasping for air. That's when locals began calling the mansion by a new name. The house that doesn't sleep. And in the center of it all, Leah, the girl who woke up at night with her fingertips burning, as if the walls were pulling her from her dreams. Suspicion always falls on the smallest shoulders. When people in power can't explain something, they look for someone weaker to blame. And so the mistress accused Leah. She said the girl was vandalizing the house, that she was possessed, that she was writing curses, that she was trying to stir rebellion. None of that was true, but truth has never protected children, especially not enslaved children. The overseer dragged Leah into the main hall one morning and stood her beneath the chandelier imported from Portugal, a symbol of wealth, superiority, domination. "Did you carve those names?" he asked. Leah looked down at her small hands. She shook her head, but when the overseer lifted her chin and forced her to meet his eyes, she said something that made the room colder than any winter wind. "I just hear them." The hall went silent. Even the overseer paused. "What do you mean, hear them?" Leah swallowed. "They call me. When someone dies, they come to me. They don't want to disappear." Her voice didn't shake, and that frightened them even more. Children aren't supposed to speak like that, they thought, especially not children who have never known freedom. And then the priest arrived. When the mistress couldn't contain her panic anymore, she summoned a priest from the nearby town, a man named Padre Vicente. known for being patient, skeptical, and careful. He didn't believe in hauntings. He didn't believe in visions. He believed in order. And order was exactly what the plantation wanted. But the moment he stepped into the corridor, something in his expression cracked. He traced the carved names with his fingers, whispering some of them out loud. Rosa, Mateus, Ines, Joanna, names of people who had vanished without burial, people he had asked about, people he had been told were moved to another farm or too sick to receive visits. The priest realized at that moment what the walls were truly showing him, a census of the erased, a testimony of violence the powerful didn't want written. He turned to the mistress and said quietly, "This girl is not the danger here." The mistress didn't like that answer. She wasn't looking for truth. She was looking for blame. The night everything went dark. A few days later, something happened that no one in the region would forget. It started during a storm, not a normal rainstorm, a northeastern tempest that shook the windows, rattled the shutters, and made the lamps flicker violently. The enslaved community huddled together in their quarters, praying for the roofs not to cave in. Inside the Casa Grande, the mistress and her family tried to keep the storm outside, but the house had other plans, because when the lightning struck the hill, all the lamps in the mansion went out at once. Every room fell into absolute darkness, except for one, the corridor. A faint glow was coming from it, pale, like moonlight trapped under skin. And when the family rushed toward it, terrified and furious, they saw something none of them could ever explain. Every single name on the wall was glowing, not brightly, not aggressively, just enough to be seen, just enough to refuse being forgotten. Liao was standing at the end of the corridor, her small frame perfectly still, her eyes wide, not in fear, but in recognition, as if she'd been waiting, as if the names had been waiting too. And then, from the far end of the house, someone screamed, not the scream of the living, something deeper, older, a sound people described later as the voice of the unburied. The masters tried to silence the corridor. After that night, the plantation owners tried everything. They sealed the corridor. They blocked it with wooden beams. They covered the walls with heavy fabric. They brought another priest, one less patient, more violent with his rituals. But nothing worked. Each attempt only made the names carve themselves deeper, and the more they tried to erase the dead, the louder the enslaved community spoke about Leah. Some believed she was a chosen child. Some believed she carried the memories of the land. Some believed the spirits used her because she wasn't afraid to listen. But the masters didn't care about meaning. They cared about control. And Leah, with her quiet truth, was becoming dangerous. So they made a decision, a cruel one that would shape everything that came next. Before I continue, I want you to place yourself inside this moment, not as a distant observer of history, but as someone standing in that house, hearing storm winds crawl across the roof, feeling the weight of the truth pressing against the walls. Ask yourself, what does a society built on silence fear the most? Not rebellion, not weapons, not escape. It fears witnesses. And in 1868, on a plantation Maranhão, the smallest witness was the one they feared the most, a 12-year-old girl, Leah, the child who heard what the dead refused to swallow. The decision that would break the plantation. After the glowing names, after the screams that no one could explain, after a week of restless nights and panicked whispers inside the house, the masters concluded that the problem wasn't the corridor. It was Leah. She was the source, they said. The cause, the vessel, the disturbance. Of course, that was a lie. But lies are easier to punish than truths. So they announced quietly, behind closed doors, that Liao would be sent away, not to another plantation, to a disciplinary house deep inland, a place known among the enslaved community as O Fundo do Mundo, the end of the world. People sent there didn't return. When the enslaved people heard the news, something shifted, not loudly, not in open defiance, but in a quiet, burning way, the kind of silence that comes before something irreversible, because Liao wasn't just a child to them. She was the one who remembered, the one who honored the dead, the one who wrote the truth no one else could speak. Taking her away wasn't punishment. It was erasure, the last night before her removal. That evening, the plantation felt wrong. Birds refused to perch near the house. Dogs paced nervously, whining at shadows. Even the overseer, a man who laughed at superstition, kept glancing over his shoulder as he walked. Leah stayed silent through it all. She sat on the dirt near the quarters, her back against the old tamarind tree. Her knees pulled her chest. Some of the older women came to her, offering food, offering prayers, offering words she couldn't absorb. She only asked one question, whisper like a thought slipping through her lips. If they take me, who will remember them? The women cried softly, not because they had an answer, but because they didn't. Midnight walked through the corridor. As night deepened, something pulled Leah toward the house. She rose slowly, as if guided by something invisible, and walked barefoot toward the forbidden corridor. No one saw her enter. No one followed. The house was dim, lit only by the last embers of dying candles. But the corridor, that place of carved names and restless memory, felt strangely warm. When Leah stepped inside, the walls trembled, not like an earthquake, more like a breath held too long. She touched the first name, the one that had started everything. Anna. Her fingers brushed the carved letters, and she felt it, the presence. Not a ghost, not a voice. A weight, a memory, a truth, a recognition. One by one, she ran her hand along the names, whispering each one, as if saying goodbye. But the walls didn't let her, because as she touched the last name at the far end of the corridor, something happened that would be told in Maranhão for more than a century. The wall cracked, a thin, jagged line running horizontally, as if the house itself was opening a wound. And through that crack came a faint, chilling sound, a chorus of breaths, not human breaths, the breaths of people who were never buried. The masters found her. By dawn, the household was awake in panic. The mistress ordered a search. She swore she heard footsteps near her room, whispers in the hallway, someone crying inside a wall. When they found Leah, she was sitting calmly in the corridor, back against a cracked wall, eyes half open as if she hadn't fully returned from wherever she'd been. The overseer grabbed her arm and shouted, "What did you do?" Leah didn't resist. She didn't speak. She simply looked at the wall. And the wall, freshly cracked, the plaster dust still on her hair, felt alive. The mistress demanded the priest come immediately, hysterically insisting that the child had invited something into the house. But Padre Vicente didn't look at the girl. He looked at the names, and then at the crack going through them like a spine. He whispered, barely audible, "This house is confessing." But the overseer wasn't interested in confessions. He had orders. Leah was to be removed at sunrise the next day, and so the preparations began. The enslaved community didn't sleep. That night, no one in the slave quarters closed their eyes. Mothers held their children tighter. Men sat with fists clenched, not out of rage, but out of helplessness. Old women whispered prayers in African languages of plantation owners tried to beat out of them decades earlier. Everyone knew what sending Leah away meant. It wasn't exile. It was disappearance. But what could they do? They were outnumbered, unarmed, watched, until someone suggested something simple, something quiet, something brilliant. If we cannot save her body, an elder said, we will save her truth. They decided not to rebel openly, not to incite violence. None of that would have worked. Instead, they chose the one thing the masters could never stop. They would spread her story. Leah's truth became a whisper movement. Under cover of darkness, they moved from hut to hut, repeating the names Leah had written, teaching the children, teaching the elders, teaching anyone who would listen. Dozens of names memorized in a single night, names of the erased carried into minds like seeds. This was more powerful than any uprising, because revolts can be crushed, weapons can be confiscated, bodies can be punished, but memory can infect a whole region. By sunrise, Leah's list of names existed in dozens of hearts, quiet, undeniable, living. The masters had no idea. The morning of the removal, when the sun rose, the air felt heavier than usual. The sky was colorless, washed out like the world was holding its breath. The overseer dragged Leah from the quarters, tying her wrists with rough rope. She didn't struggle. She simply looked at the house, as if saying goodbye to a friend. Padre Vicente stood nearby, disturbed but powerless. He kept touching the cross around his neck, as though unsure whether prayer or truth mattered more. The mistress refused to come out of her room. She said she could feel the dead watching. And maybe she was right, because as Leah was pulled toward the cart that would take her inland, something happened behind them. The corridor door slammed open on its own. The sound echoed across the yard like thunder. Everyone froze, because carved into the fresh wood of the door, a door that had been replaced only days earlier, was a new name, a name no one had ever seen before, a name carved so deep that the letters bled splinters. Leah. The overseer stepped back. Padre Vicente crossed himself. Even the wind stopped. Leah stared at the name and whispered, "They don't want me to go." But the masters would not listen. Fear can twist the human mind into something merciless. And fear was the only thing guiding them now. The overseer lifted Leah into the cart. Padre Vicente tried to intervene, gently, quietly, diplomatically, but he was pushed aside. And so the cart began to move, the wheels crunching over dry earth, the child sitting alone, the enslaved community watching, helpless and trembling. But the house was not finished speaking, because as the cart reached the gate, something shook deep inside the mansion. A sound like walls tearing, like plaster breaking, like names forcing themselves into existence. The plantation owners would later swear the sound came from the earth. The enslaved people knew better. The dead were rising through memory. The cart reached the edge of the property, and the world seemed to tilt. The oxen stopped, not because they were tired, not because the road was steep. They stopped because the ground beneath them shuddered. The overseer shouted, whipped the air, cursed at the animals. They refused to move. Leah looked back at the house. From that distance, the Casa Grande looked like every other colonial mansion in Brazil. White walls, tall windows, arrogance built into its very shape. But she knew better. And in that moment, it knew her too. Because as everyone watched in horrified silence, a thin line of dust rose from the roof, as if something inside the house had cracked open all at once. A second later, the sound reached them, walls breaking, glass shattering, a deep, wrenching groan, like the land itself was exhaling after holding something in for far too long. The overseer turned pale. "Go!" he barked at the driver. "Now!" The man at the reins hesitated, then finally forced the oxen forward. The cart moved. Leah didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just pressed her bound hands together and whispered the names she had carved, one by one, like a rosary built from memory instead of beads. Ana, Rosa, Mateus, Ines, Joaquim, Maria. The further she went, the lighter her body felt, as if each name she had carried was no longer trapped inside her, but moving, spreading, reaching beyond the walls that had once tried to contain them. Hours later, when the house was finally inspected, the scene was unlike anything the region had ever witnessed. The north corridor, the one they had tried to seal, repaint, block, sanctify, had split open from end to end. The plaster was torn, the beams exposed, the floor cracked, and on every available fragment, wall, doorframe, beam, and fissure, names, not just the original ones. Dozens more, hundreds, some said, names of people who had died on that land long before Leah was born. Names of Africans unloaded at the nearby port and buried in unmarked graves. Names no one alive remembered. And yet, there they were. The house had turned itself inside out to confess. The owners tried to rebuild. They had money, connections, status. They hired masons. They imported new wood. They ordered fresh plaster. But every time a new surface dried, it cracked. Every time they sanded a beam, faint letters appeared along the grain. Every attempt to erase the past only carved it deeper. Visitors stopped coming. Priests refused to spend the night. Neighbors started crossing themselves whenever they rode past the old hill. Rumors spread. They said the house was cursed. They said the dead had claimed it. They said anyone who tried to live there would hear names crawling along the walls at night. But quietly, among the enslaved and formerly enslaved, a different version spread. They said the house had finally told the truth, and that a child had taught it how. No one on the plantation ever saw Leah again. The cart had taken her toward the interior, toward the so-called end of the world, and after that, silence. No letters, no witnesses, no records. For the masters, that was convenient. No child, no scandal. No messenger, no memory. But history has a way of leaking through cracks, because a few years later, stories began to surface in other towns. Stories that sounded familiar. In one village, a woman swore that the walls of her employer's house began to show faint scratches after an enslaved boy was killed in secret. She said a girl had been seen nearby, thin, quiet, with eyes that watched the walls more than the people. In another town, a traveling priest spoke in confession about a child who claimed she could hear names in the bricks of an old jail. In yet another place, a midwife talked about a girl who worked silently in the kitchen, but traced names into steam whenever pots boiled. None of these stories named her, but every single one mentioned the same detail. A child who touched walls and made them remember. And then came 1871. Brazil passed a law of the free womb, declaring that children born to enslaved women would technically be free, but forced to work until adulthood. It was not freedom. It was fear dressed up as compromise. Elite families congratulated themselves. They called it progress. But on the ground, in fields, in ports, in quilombos hidden in forests, the enslaved community knew better. They knew laws could be written to look merciful and still be built on cruelty. They also knew something else. You cannot hold a system together once the dead start speaking. By the 1870s, across Maranhão and beyond, whispered stories of a menina dos nomes, the girl of the names, circulated from plantation to plantation. People who had never met Leah spoke about her, as if she were a legend, a warning, a promise. She wrote the names on the walls so they could never pretend we disappeared, some said. She taught the houses to talk, others added. Wherever she goes, the dead stop being silent. Decades passed. Slavery was finally abolished in Brazil in 1888, the last country in the Americas to do it. The official narrative spoke about princes, laws, signatures on elegant paper. They praised decrees, not the people who had fought, escaped, rebelled, remembered. They did not mention Leah. They did not mention houses that cracked themselves open with names. They did not mention corridors that refused to forget, but oral history did. In Maranhão, old people would sit in the shade and tell children. There was once a girl who wrote the names of the dead inside the big house. The masters tried to send her away, but the walls followed her. They said that if you slept in certain colonial homes, you could hear scratching at night. Not rats, not tree branches, letters, names, the past trying to write itself back into the present. Fast forward with me for a moment. Imagine you're in Brazil today, maybe visiting on vacation, maybe watching this from far away, but feeling strangely pulled by its history. You walk into a restored colonial house turned into a museum. Its walls are painted white, the floors polished, the furniture arranged to look authentic and elegant for tourists. A guide explains dates, names of rich families, architectural styles. They say words like heritage, legacy, tradition, but as you stand there listening, something tightens in your chest. You look at the walls. Really look. You notice a thin crack running just below the ceiling. You see a darker patch beneath the fresh paint. You feel watched. You can't prove it. You can't explain it. But a thought crosses your mind. How many lives are missing from this story? How many names were never spoken here? Now imagine, just for a second, that on the other side of that paint, layers and layers of it, there's a name carved by a child in 1868, a name no archive mentions, a name no museum plaque honors, a name that still wants to be heard. That is what this story is really about. Not just a haunted house, not just a girl with an uncanny gift. Not even just a plantation in Maranhão in 1868. It is about the violence of being erased. About how slavery wasn't only chains, whips, and forced labor. It was also a deliberate, calculated attempt to erase identities, families, stories, entire worlds. And about how sometimes the simplest act of resistance is to write a name where it was never meant to exist. On a wall, on a beam, inside your memory, on a screen, right now as you listen to this. Because whether you're in the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else, you live in a world built on names that were recorded and names that were buried. You've heard the official ones. The question is, what will you do with the ones that were never meant to reach you? So, let's be honest with each other for a moment. You and I can't go back to 1868. We can't stand in front of that corridor and tell Ya she was not crazy, not dangerous, not cursed. We can't pull her off that card. We can't break her chains with our bare hands. But we can refuse to repeat what was done to her and to the people whose names she carved. We can question the histories we're handed as neutral, clean, and complete. We can ask museums whose stories they are not telling. We can look at every elegant old house and remember that for someone, it was a prison. And we can carry this girl with us. A child who listened to the dead when no one else would. A child who turned a corridor into a graveyard of truth. A child who taught a house to betray its masters. So the next time you walk into a room and feel that strange heaviness, that sense that the air knows more than it's saying, don't rush past it. Stop. Listen. Maybe it's just your imagination. Or maybe it's history pushing against the paint, asking not to be buried again. Because in a world that keeps trying to cover up what it did, the most radical thing you can do is remember the names they tried to erase. And that is the legacy of that child in Maranhão, 1868. She could not free their bodies, but she refused to let their names die. In a world built on forgetting, remembering became her rebellion.